our colleagues, we were sitting around last year, and I don't need to tell this group that defense and military issues really don't rise to the top of a lot of Americans' radar screen right now. It's healthcare, it's Supreme Court, financial reform, and others, but it's important to us to promote defense issues even when no one wants to talk about it. And so that's why we've selected the month of May as what we call Protect America Month. And we will launch this a week from today. Heritage's President's Club meeting will have a closing address by the House Minority Whip, Eric Cantor. We'll talk about the need to refocus the nation on a strong defense.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Ed Royce from Orange County, California. I serve on the Financial Services Committee, and for much of my tenure there, have had a running battle with the majority of the members on the committee over this question of whether or not we should have the kind of government intervention in the marketplace that increases moral hazard and that removes market discipline. And I'll give you a quick example of one of the issues that we worked on over the years and frankly was one of the causes for the systemic risk that was introduced into the financial system. And that is in respect to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-sponsored enterprises. In 1992 or 1993, in 1992, Congress passed the GSE Act. And in that act, they put, the Congress put certain mandates on the GSE, certain goals that had to be achieved. Ultimately, those goals led to the government-sponsored enterprises over-leveraging at a rate of 100 to 1 and building up a portfolio of $1.5 trillion in mortgage-backed securities that they carried. One half of that portfolio was in subprime and Alt-A loans. That was by design. That was an attempt by Congress in order to get the public into housing. And the Federal Reserve came to the Congress about 2003, 2004. They were concerned about the systemic risk that this posed to, as they stated at the time, the financial system globally, because there was the possibility of losing $1 trillion in the housing market. Politicians had muscled the system so that we'd gone from a traditionally 20% down to 3% down and ultimately 0% down on loans, and we had created a market for countrywide and other forms of junk mortgages. Since one half of the mortgage portfolio held by the GSEs had to be in these subprime and Alt-A loans, we were in fact creating this market. But we were also doing something else. Congress was doing something else equally damaging. By creating a duopoly here, by giving Fannie and Freddie the implied support of the government, the implied government backstop, the implied bailout, they sent a message to the market, and so the cost of capital for the GSEs were lower than their competition. They were able to push their competition out of business. They were able to leverage much more than any private institution would have been able to leverage, right? The upshot was we lost $1 trillion in the housing market. This is where the collapse began.
So much of the debate up till now had been focused on the $50 billion bailout authority. And that is important, and that is very real. Despite the fact that President Obama said it's not legitimate to talk about it, we need to talk about it. But that is not the only problem in the bill. And I think you have the paper, or it was in the paper I wrote on 14 problems, 14 fatal flaws in the Dodd bill. It's actually more than 14, but that's as many as I could write down. The one that I've gotten feedback on the most is number 14. And that was put last for a reason. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, their absence from the bill. So I think the best answer is what's not in the bill is it may be the most egregious part. So ultimately, if you trust the government, if you trust regulators, you will like this bill. If you don't trust the government, if you don't trust what regulators will decide for you, you probably won't like this bill. And I think that gets to a basic divide in politics today, a basic divide in the country, and one in which I think that the American people will side with, on which the American people will side with us. Because essentially, I don't think the public is in a mood to trust the government right now, and for good reason.
Congressman, is financial reform really necessary?
Well, financial reform is necessary, and the Republicans have an alternative bill, but what we're doing here is a permanent bailout authority, as one of my Democratic colleagues refers to this legislation as, and I think the consequences of that is to increase the amount of moral hazard, as the economists tell us, and sort of guarantee additional problems that are going to come as a result of giving this government the right now to decide which firms are too big to fail and which are too small to save. Just one consequence of that, by having the government so designate a firm or having the power to do that, the difference in competitive advantage, your cost of capital is going to be about 1% less if you manage to be too big to fail. And so you'll be able to do what Fannie and Freddie Mac did against their competition. When they had that implied government backstop, they were able to force them out of business because their cost of capital were so much lower. Their cost of borrowing was so much lower. So this is my concern here. We've allowed the government basically not only to pick winners and losers in this, but in the future, if a firm goes down, the government can decide, okay, which creditors are paid off, which shareholders. I just think that instead of doing this, we should do what the Republicans in the Senate want to do. We know that how we handle bankruptcy, for major institutions like airlines or trains. These types of companies go through an expedited bankruptcy where everybody takes a haircut or everybody takes the loss, but not the taxpayer. And the fact that there is that knowledge in the market creates market discipline. It means that you don't loan to those companies, you don't get too over leveraged. You only loan what you can afford to. On the other hand, if you know the government's behind it, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there's no end to the amount of leverage in loaning. That leverage was 100 to 1. This is what worries me about this legislation.
There was a vote last night in the Senate where the reform failed. What do you think will happen in the future as a result of that?
My hope is that they include the Republican ideas, as I've just discussed, of doing this through the courts, doing this through our traditional way of handling bankruptcy, rather than put the government in charge here with this kind of authority and power. And if some compromise like that can be worked out, that would be so preferable to the legislation that we're talking about that Chris Dodd is trying to bring before the Senate.
Great. So I recently wrote a paper about financial reform bill and 14 points that you felt were wrong, things that were wrong with the bill. Can you explain some of those things, some of the most egregious examples of what's wrong with the bill?
Sure. Most people have heard about the $50 billion bailout fund that's in the bill. The president says that that's not a legitimate topic to raise, but it certainly is one of the foremost problems with the bill, that although the supporters say that it ends bailouts, it actually provides for them. But the problems don't end there. It also includes something called resolution authority, where the government has the authority to shut down firms that it believes are failing. Certainly we need a procedure for failing firms, for a bankruptcy procedure, for some way to close down firms through a judicial process, but to have the government decide that on its own with limited judicial review is really dangerous. Other provisions of the bill would also contradict the stated goals of the supporters, of too big to fail. The supporters say that the bill would prevent or end the doctrine that some firms are simply too big to be allowed to fail. But at the same time, it requires regulators to identify firms that are significant economic players whose failure would have adverse effects on the economy. That really is code for a firm that is too big to fail. So in the process of in the context of a bill that is meant to end this doctrine, you're actually extending it and identifying firms that the government is going to support. That will have dangerous consequences. One other problem with the bill is in the rather innocuous sounding Consumer Protection Agency that is created. Now, certainly everyone is in favor of consumer protection. No one wants to see consumers deceived, victims of fraud, to be misled. All those things are illegal now and should be illegal. But the problem is that the provisions in this bill create an agency that has powers to go far beyond that. In fact, rather than protecting consumers and ensure that they are informed and voluntarily take on obligations and sign contracts that they want to engage in, that it would prohibit them from acquiring certain products or agreeing to certain conditions. That's going to limit their choices and limit the credit availability, limit their ability to get the financial services they want. So rather than consumer protection, it actually is consumer limitation.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were pointed to as a couple of examples of something that was wrong with the whole system and led a lot to this financial crisis. Do you think going forward something's going to happen there? What's going on with the bill with regard to them?
Well, the bill, I think, mentions them once or twice in passing. As a factor to consider here and there, perhaps a report, but seriously, the bill does nothing significant to address the problems of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It essentially ignores their role in the crisis, their massive bailout that they've received from the taxpayer. This is really the dog that is not barking in this legislation. It's conspicuous by its absence.